and most welcome to all of you attending this seminar, and not least all the participants, speakers, and discussants. My name is Agneta Blad, and I will be the moderator of this webinar. I'm a board member of one of the organizers, the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP, and also chairman of the Swedish Research Council. My professional background is in the higher education and research area, having had different leading positions there. Last year, 2020, marked the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The resolution recognizes the importance of women's role in preventing and resolving conflict, and urges all actors to adopt gender perspectives to peace and security. It also stresses the need to increase women's meaningful participation in peace processes. During the past 2 decades, an increasing number of UN member states have adopted their own government-led national action plans to ensure the country's implementation of the UN Resolution 1325. These national action plans are crucial to ensuring implementation of the resolution, as they encourage member states to assess priorities and responsibilities in line with the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the national level, and can act as a guarantee that countries will follow through with their commitments. As of April 2021, last month, 92 countries have adopted national action plans, and the hope is that there are more to come. The importance of women's meaningful participation in all stages of peace and security for sustainable peace to prevail cannot be taken for granted, but must be both debated and assessed. It is crucial that we can establish key areas of involvement and best practices in how to achieve a sustainable process for peace and disarmament, and detail how the inclusion and integration of women will best contribute to this objective. Today, May 24th, on the occasion of the International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament, the Institute for Security Policy Development Policy and its Korea Center, in cooperation with a Korean Women's Development Institute, has invited 4 very distinguished speakers from East Asia and Europe to share their perspectives and lessons learned on the implementation of Women, Peace and Security agenda. We start with a presentation of from Sweden, followed by South Korea, Switzerland, and Japan. The discussion is thereafter started by 3 distinguished experts from Mongolia, European Union, and Turkey, who are contributing with different perspectives. The panel gives the opportunity, or the speakers in the panel gives the opportunity to give comments to these perspectives, and thereafter there is time for questions from the audience taken from the Q&A function. I will introduce the speakers and the discussants as they start talking. And now we start with the first speaker. It's a presentation by Mrs. Carolina Wrethem from Sweden. Mrs. Wrethem is Deputy Director at the Department of UN Policy, Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden, and Policy Specialist on Women, Peace and Security. She leads the work on the Swedish National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, and has extensive experience in the field of gender equality, human rights and development, from both the Swedish government and multilateral institutions. Mrs. Wrethon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agneta. Colleagues and friends, let me first thank the ISDP for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is important for international peace and security. It does not operate in a vacuum. And there is a growing understanding of the need to engage the whole population, the need of legitimate peace processes, the importance of addressing the experience that both women and men, boys and girls have in conflict, not the least sexual violence, but still, as just said, 20 years after the adoption of the first resolution, 1325, we struggle to implement that one. Not the least to say that we still struggle to implement the consecutive resolutions. And this is, of course, far from acceptable. To enlarge the commitment, the ownership and the leadership of the agenda is key, and we therefore are especially happy that we also today can have regional discussions and talks about how to increase and engage the amount of countries, communities, regional organizations that actually push and promote the implementation. And let me just first underline that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a Swedish priority. It's expressed through our feminist foreign policy, our national action plan, and our everyday efforts to integrate it into all policies and activities related to peace and security. First of all, we apply a mainstreaming approach to women, peace and security. It's, for example, expressed this year by Sweden holding the chairpersonship of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, where we integrate women, peace and security in all three dimensions of the organization: the political, military, the economic, and the humanitarian dimension. And the way that we mainstream women, peace and security is also playing out both in country-specific support as well as thematic work. And I'll say a few words on both country-specific work and thematic work. For example, we are supporting and financing local civil society organizations in Sudan, and we financed gender advisors to the Sudanese government after the transition from dictatorship to democracy. And we also supported in Sudan a development of a national action plan on the part of the Sudanese government. In Yemen, women, peace and security and development of gender equality is a priority for Sweden. We hosted several meetings with women peace builders. Our minister has been very active in following and having meetings with women peace builders and women civil society organizations also in Yemen. And we strengthen women's participation through support to the UN-led mediation efforts. And lastly, I'll mention also Afghanistan, where Sweden has supported the Afghan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace to strengthen women's participation. And also we were crucial, or we had a key role in making sure that gender equality was central in the donor conference last year. And thematically, this is also an issue that we make efforts to integrate in work related to peace and security. And I'll mention both violent extremism and arms control. In our work towards violent extremism, we take both women and men's experiences and fragilities to exposure to violent extremism into account, and use gender equality as a lens in looking into how different kind of preventive work can address masculinity norms, for example, or how violent extremist movements reach out specifically to women, for example. Sweden is also a strong proponent of gender responsive arms control and for a gender sensitive perspective and countering illicit flows of small arms and light weapons. And we are a strong supporter of the Arms Trade Treaty, which includes provisions on assessing the risk for exported materials to be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. And to accelerate this work, we think there is a need for different kind of infrastructure and support. There's a need for capacity within national administrations, both in capital and in the field. There's also a need to support mediators, and we have created in Sweden a women's mediators network who are also engaged in several conflicts, and we cooperate with other national and regional networks, and are happy to see that there is a Southeast Asian network being created. We also work dedicatedly with civil society organizations, which we think are key to both prevent conflict and have inclusive conflict resolution strategies and work. And Sweden supports civil society, and specifically women's civil society organizations in conflict situations, and work very closely with them and make sure, or we try as much as we can to ensure that they are integrated in consultations and can have a possibility to participate in both strategies for peace process, but also implementation of peace agreements. And lastly, I'd like to mention also that we are a strong we strongly advocate for the need for data and facts and statistics, and that international institutions and organizations should collect sex disaggregated data. And Sweden has a national action plan. We have a national action plan since 2006. We have currently our third national action plan, which is just about to be, we haven't said yet we will actually adopt a new action plan, but we will have a prolongation or a restructuring of the current action plan. So we will have a fourth action plan coming in probably in 2021. We have not a set budget for a national action plan. We have specifically wanted the budget to be integrated into ordinary budgets, and that the national action plan should be owned by the ordinary institutions and by the ordinary management. Nevertheless, Sweden has committed around 1 billion Swedish kronor, I think that's €1 million, to the National Action Plan last year. And a lot of that is, of course, also specifically to the support in the field. We just conducted an external evaluation of our National Action Plan, which highlights both the need for the strategic forward-looking action plan, but also the political commitment needed to push it forward. It's very clear in the evaluation that the adoption of a feminist foreign policy has accelerated the implementation and the ownership of the National Action Plan. The evaluation also looks further into having synergies between the National Action Plan and other policies on gender equality that we operate with in Sweden. So this is something also that we will look further into. The National Action Plan has supported and helped national agencies to conduct work in the field, but also to have a larger kind of integration of women, peace and security within their own work. We work with 11 national agencies. The larger ones would be the police, the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, the armed forces, but also agencies that work within a smaller piece, maybe in their international work, so such as the Prison and Probation Service, the Prosecution Authority, and also the academia. And through the action plan, Sweden supports not just specific projects and cooperation, but also gender experts in peace missions, and we trade deployed staff and support local projects. Also with the National Action Plan, there is an inclusion of civil society. So there's a working group connected to the action plan that consists of both national authorities and civil society organizations. And it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that leads the work together in conjunction, as the Swedish government is constructed with the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Justice. I'd just like to end with mentioning a few issues that we feel also that we'd like to address further now when we are looking into our own new National Action Plan. in our own development of the policy that we are doing. One is, of course, health issues. The current pandemic has highlighted the need to connect women, peace and security to health issues in terms of showing that women's participation is crucial also in conflict, in resilience efforts and conflict prevention, as we know that the pandemic has increased risks for prolonging and evoking conflicts, and also have challenged the situation for women extraordinarily, not the least in terms of violence against women. Economic issues is also something that we look further into, connecting women's economic empowerment to women's ability and possibility to participate in peace processes and conflict resolution. We also look at the digitalization and think that this is an issue that we could stress further, related to information and disinformation, and also addressing the gender divide or the digital gender divide. And lastly, and this is not an exclusive list, I'd like to just mention climate and security, as we operate in a world facing serious and urgent environmental challenges, also connected to conflict and fragile contexts are more exposed to climate insecurity, where it's really needed that women and girls are able to both be part and parcel of combating climate insecurity, but also contributing to sustainable development and solutions. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm very happy to take questions or comments, and I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolina, very much. And now we turn to our second speaker. We continue with a presentation by Dr. Ji-So Yoon from South Korea, Seoul. Dr. Yoon is Associate Research Fellow at Korean Women's Development Institute in Seoul. She received her PhD in political science from the Pennsylvania State University in US. In 2020, she was a member of the research team that prepared evaluation of the first and second phases of the third and 25 National Action Plan and drafting of the third phase. A research project commissioned by the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in South Korea. Dr. Yoon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both ISDP and KWDI for giving me the opportunity to present on the Women, Peace and Security agenda in South Korea. Well, the South Korean government first began the process of drafting the National Action Plan in 2012, which was completed in 2014. So the South Korean National Action Plan is about 7 years old. And in this past 7 years, well, the first National Action Plan was declared in 2014, the second one in 2018, and very recently in April 2021, the government just released the third National Action Plan, which covers the years between 2021 to 2024. I'd like to mention that the Framework Act on Gender Equality serves as the legal basis. So Article 41 of this act, which was newly inserted into existing law in 2017. So just before the second National Action Plan was released, this article was inserted, and it states that government shall formulate and implement the National Action Plan in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And the same act, Article 11, states that the Gender Equality Council under the Prime Minister's office deliberates on and coordinates matters regarding the National Action Plan. So this is the ultimate body with authority to coordinate and declare the National Action Plan. So what was the momentum to develop the National Action Plan initially in South Korea? Well, it was really initiated and led by the civil society. A group called Women Making Peace, which is a local women's group in the country, it first launched an event to raise public awareness on this issue early on in 2006, but was not really much successful in mobilizing support. And in 2011, the organization, along with other important women's groups in the country, sent letters to the Foreign Affairs Minister demanding the government to act on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And in the same year, members of the National Assembly in Korea passed a resolution calling for the government to draft South Korea's National Action Plan. And in response to such demands, in 2013, the government led a number of consultation group meetings in preparation of drafting the National Action Plan. And so overall, we can say that the initial push to draft the National Action Plan came from women's groups, from the civil society, and the National Assembly also played a role in nudging the government to draft the National Action Plan in South Korea. Well, let me move on to talking to you a little bit about the specific focuses of South Korea's National Action Plan. Well, first and foremost, the major goal is to mainstream gender in the policies on national defense, foreign affairs, security, peace, unification, and public safety. And so this, in this regard, it might not, the focus might not be too distinct from other national action plans in other countries. But then this process is led by the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in South Korea, which is a bit distinct from other countries. And I think the fact that the major goal is to mainstream gender in the security sector, I think this kind of justifies Ministry of Gender Equality and Family taking the lead in this government-wide effort to draft and implement the National Action Plan in South Korea. Second feature of South Korea's National Action Plan that's a bit distinct is that both historical and geographical contexts play an important role in shaping the content of what is South Korea's National Action Plan today. So during World War II, South Korea suffered from violations of women's rights, namely in the form of forced military sexual slavery, also known as comfort women, by the Japanese Imperial Army. And in this regard, the National Action Plan reaffirms the government's commitment to raise awareness of the international community on this issue and to provide support for the victims of conflict during World War II. And similarly, Korean Peninsula remains divided under an agreement that resulted from the Korean War. And such a context explains the government's effort to seek avenues for fostering inter-Korean cooperation, which means North Korea and South Korea cooperating on the agenda of women, peace, and security. And these are all discussions that are included in the current National Action Plan. And in addition, there's also an international aspect to South Korean National Action Plan. So South Korea, as we all know, is an active contributor to development cooperation and peacekeeping operations worldwide. And this explains South Korea's promises to strengthen international development cooperation in the areas of women, peace, and security. So what are some of the things that have been achieved that South Korean National Action Plan was able to achieve so far? Most importantly, the National Action Plan was successful in implementing the objectives and strategies outlined in both the first and second generations of the National Action Plan. And so most targets have been fulfilled as planned, particularly when it comes to quantitative indicators of relevant targets. And second, we also notice an involvement of more government ministries and agencies getting involved in the National Action Plan over time. And so the first National Action Plan involved 8 ministries, the second 9 ministries, and most recently, the third National Action Plan involves 10 ministries in total. And I say that we can take this as a sign of growing importance of the women, peace, and security agenda inside the Korean government. Another achievement is that the women, peace, and security agenda has expanded over time. So not necessarily in terms of its quantity, but in quality. And so by this, what I mean is that the total number of goals and strategies may not have increased, but the understanding of the women, peace, and security agenda has deepened. So for instance, in the very recently issued third generation of National Action Plan, states under the participation pillar pursue local dissemination of the women, peace, and security agenda, which aims to support efforts of local governments and civil society groups to further the women, peace, and security agenda in their local communities. And so really the new National Action Plan pays attention to this growing localization efforts of the women, peace, and security agenda around the world. And we have tried to kind of localize those efforts within the South Korean context as well. The final achievement is that the monitoring and evaluation process has been strengthened over time. And so in order to ensure effective implementation, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family convenes a monitoring meeting once a year with the participation of each implementing ministry and civic advisors. So this happened once a year, but the recent National Action Plan takes a step further by requiring each implementing agency to conduct its own monitoring meeting once a year, in addition to what was already done that was led by the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. And so really dual measures to check the monitoring and evaluation process. So, but of course, some challenges remain, and let me talk about 3 major challenges that I see as being most problematic. First, there's no separate budget allocated to relevant government ministries to really implement the National Action Plan. And so what this means is that it's difficult for ministries to develop an extensive agenda on this topic because implementing strategies and actions entails money. Second challenge is that there's limited public awareness, as well as that of government officials who don't really directly engage in drafting and implementing the National Action Plan. And this makes it really difficult for the women, peace, and security agenda to become a central part of the government's core priorities, since people do not simply know what UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is about, people in general, I mean. And the final challenge is that the involvement of civil society is still quite limited if we think about the whole entire process. And so we know that representatives of civil society groups are included in the public-private consultation body, meaning that civil society may give feedback and approval of what the government has already drafted and what the government is planning to do. But this does not mean that the civil society groups actively set and implement goals of their own. And so this I see as being another major challenge. Well, so do I think a National Action Plan is a good mechanism for implementing women, peace, and security agenda? I say yes. I believe there's no better way to advance the women's security agenda other than through the National Action Plan. But it's important for future versions of South Korea's National Action Plan to find ways to address the kinds of challenges that I just mentioned. Well, that's all I have prepared for now. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Soo-young. Now for the third presentation, we go back to Europe and Switzerland and Dr. Leandra Bias, who is a gender advisor and senior researcher at the Practice and Research Institute Swiss Peace. Dr. Bias regularly advises foreign ministries, international organizations, and civil society on the gender dynamics of conflict and feminist ways to conflict prevention and transformation. She is currently coordinating the project Swiss Civil Society Contribution to the implementation of the Swiss National Action Plan 1325. Please, Leandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and I'd like to thank you all as well for having me and Swiss Peace and to give a civil society perspective on it all. Well, so to start off, where is Switzerland at the moment? We are one of, if I've been updated correctly, the few countries that already has a 4th national action plan, which is running since 2018 until 2023, and we'll see whether it's going to be updated or whether similar to Sweden, it will be more of a just rebrandishing. But the crucial aspect of that is that for the very first time, civil society is an active implementing partner in it. So we are listed among, next to the different ministries that are implementing it, civil society is one of them. And specifically both Swiss civil society as well as civil society abroad. And we really think that is one of the big achievements that obviously didn't come out of nowhere, similar to what Dr. Yoon was telling us. Civil society in Switzerland has been at the forefront of pushing for a national action plan ever since its first inception. And in this particular regard, this happened because, first of all, the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs financed the shadow report back in 2016, where we could really evaluate what had been going on. And obviously several recommendations came out of that. And what we were very glad about is that 2 main recommendations were picked up and actually included in the following national action plan, the one that is currently being implemented. And in addition to that, there was also a public hearing hosted together with a working group that Swiss Peace is actually facilitating. And I think that's quite an important distinction I should make here as well. Swiss Peace as such is more of a consultancy and a think tank, but we host a platform that rallies over 40 Swiss NGOs actually. And so that is the civil society part we're talking about. And so the 2 points that were taken up and that we are really proud of is that, first of all, we said that there has to be increased focus on the connection that has been established between UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its follow-up resolution back in 2015, so 2242 resolution, which advocates for, as was mentioned earlier by Carolina, that we connect women also with prevention of violent extremism. And what we as civil society saw there is that this can potentially be a difficult connection there, because we start connecting an originally peaceful agenda that advocates for demilitarization with a goal that is fairly associated with militarized means. Or to say it differently, it's about women's empowerment no longer being a goal in itself, but a tool for preventing violent extremism. And so that we found quite worrying, and we were very glad to have had the opportunity to look at that more in detail in the past 3 years. And I'll come back to that in a second. And the second point was that we saw that while there is a lot of commitment to women's participation in peace processes, there's very little discussion about what the actual socioeconomic conditions have to look like to make that possible. And so we said that there has to be more investigation on what the care economy has to do with all of this. And I'll come back to that too. But these, I can say, the very fact that the Swiss government took up these priorities and gave us a mandate, in a sense, for 4 years to look at this in detail is a big achievement in itself. And we are very glad to be part of the process. And so what we, and an additional point to this that is very important to highlight is that in this process of Swiss civil society being an implementing partner, we did not only say that this allows us to look at these 2 particular points, but more beyond that, it's also to showcase, on the one hand, the vast practical experience that is there in civil society, so that the policy implementation can be more anchored in practice. And vice versa, it's also about raising the visibility of the whole women, peace and security agenda among civil society, because it's still fairly recent and a lot of civil society still doesn't know about it and doesn't necessarily use it for advocacy. So it's a two-way stream. But now more on the two thematic areas. Well, in regards to the follow-up resolution 2242 on preventing violent and countering violent extremism, as I said, our main concern was that there is a militarization of an originally peace agenda, and that women's empowerment is no longer a goal in itself. But beyond that, we also saw that when we looked at Switzerland's National Action Plan, that it reifies harmful gender roles. In particular, it still stipulates that women are naturally more peaceful beings, and therefore they are the ones that are being included as mothers in preventing violent extremism. So there is a lot of programming going on where women are taught how to discern harmful developments, and therefore to be prevention actors, right? When really that should be a state responsibility, and therefore it places a huge burden on these women and mothers, especially, I mean, if then one of the child does get radicalized. And it does that all while failing to advocate for gender-sensitive disarmament and rehabilitation mechanisms. So you have, on the one hand, programming for mothers to prevent violent extremism, but you do not have, for example, mechanisms that would allow female perpetrators to be really identified and to be brought back into the country. So we have had two cases of that in Switzerland, and what we see is that female perpetrators really fall through the net. They're abandoned in conflict zones, often with their children, without having any documentation. So if, and it's a big if, we want prevention of violent extremism to be connected with this agenda, then as civil society, we would say, at the very least, go the extra mile and think about the stereotypes that are behind them and the harmful consequences that can come from them. Now, as to care and women's participation, there, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this phrase. We say the main problem is the add and stir method, or rather, as we say, the problem is that the women, peace and security agenda is still interpreted as a means to allow everyone to participate in war, rather than to help us wage peace together. 85% of all national action plans around the world still focus on women's participation in military structures or mediation or together, but they don't tackle the root problem of gendered roles, and therefore they fail to understand where this agenda came from. This was feminist global civil society saying we need to prevent conflict, and will only prevent it if we fight patriarchal gender roles and hierarchies between them. So to do so would mean, among other things, but crucially, it would mean to invest and animate investment where direct investment is not possible in the care economy. And that, be it in a conflict zone or what we would call a peaceful context, because this is really the sector that gets completely crushed in our current economic system, right? We speak of the care diamond, where we say that you have private entities, private companies, you have the state, you have the NGOs, and then you have private households. And when you look at who provides care, this still gets completely outsourced, or at least to a very large degree, to private households, and therefore predominantly to women still today. And that gets, in particular, that gets really increased in times of conflict and in crisis. And so in the global north, we have seen this very well with the COVID pandemic. And I'm saying global north very consciously, because it has really allowed us to highlight that this entire agenda should have relevance for the global north. We tend to think of ourselves as crisis-free, conflict-free. But if anything, it has really shown the the incredible amount of care work that has been provided by women, both in private households, but also in the care workforce, which is again, one of the sectors where austerity measures hit first. So to make it short, women do the heavy lifting. They allow everyone to go about their daily lives in conflict and peaceful contexts. And yet this critical work isn't deemed important enough to either finance or to give them access to decision-making based on the knowledge they already have. So what we say would need to happen, care work would need to be reduced, redistributed, and recognized by giving women access to the official participation. And therefore, this connection should really allow us to show that the feminist vision of positive peace, in the sense of human rights being respected for everyone and equal participation being allowed for everyone, should be just as relevant for Switzerland itself and the global north in itself. And I'd like to quote Ida Hosic, a feminist peace researcher here, with a very good quote she has from last year. She said that if we were to recognize the domestic relevance of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, I quote, it could ensure that the doses of peace medicine are administered more equitably with consideration and self-reflection, not only to presumed patients, but to doctors as well. And so I think, and I'll close with that this is one of the key challenges we see. While, as I mentioned, we are extremely proud and grateful to be part of the process, I think it's a big question mark how long feminist civil society will remain an implementing partner if root causes are not really tackled, and if it remains a complete foreign policy instrument and therefore continues to ignore the pressing issues within the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leander. And now we go back to Asia for the fourth presentation to Mrs. Hisako Motoyama. And Hisako Motoyama is a feminist activist and researcher in global governance and gender. She is a senior researcher at the Asia-Japan Research Institute of Ritsumeikan University and representative director of Asia-Japan Women's Resource Center. Please, Mrs. Motoyama, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And actually, I am not a Mrs., but I call myself Ms. So thank you very much. And I am particularly happy to make my presentation after Leandra, whom I share much concern with. So I would like to express some of the shared concern with her in the context of East Asia and Japan. So, so Japan has formulated its first 1325 National Action Plan in 2015. And now it is in the third year of the second National Action Plan, which is for 4 years between 2019 to 2022. However, I have to note that Japan has actually implemented WPS agenda since 2002 when it was involved in the support program for women in post-conflict Afghanistan. And so I have to say that it was a way to support for Japanese government to support U.S. invasion wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, because as you know, Japanese constitution severely limits options for the government for the military cooperation. So basically, support for Afghan women was a very useful way for Japan to supplement its limited support for military cooperation for the US. Okay, and now, so what is the momentum to develop National Action Plan? It not as in the Sweden or Korea, it actually came from the government. So in 2013, it was the conservative administration of Shinzo Abe government that announced the Formulate 1325 National Action Plan. And this administration was very conservative in terms of gender equality and also promoting peace. So this government featured formulating National Action Plan as under the flag of proactive contribution to peace, which is in their term, and also women shine foreign policy. This is kind of quasi-feminist foreign policy. So, but this administration's priority was to overcome the constitutional limitations of exercising military force, and also at the same time playing down the other Asian nations like Korea and China's claim over war responsibility and the opposition against Japan's expanded military laws. So it of course included comfort of women issues. So that was the reason how this conservative government found promoting WPS agenda as a useful way to expand its military roles, and also represent itself as a supporter for women elsewhere with its strong economic and also military power. And that was also the reason why civil society was relatively skeptical about the role of WPS agenda, but also that was also the reason why they got motivated to participate and influence the process. And actually, I served as a coordinator for the as a civil society working group at this process. So. However, having said that, this drafting process became very participatory. The women's groups, including my organization and other NGOs, negotiated for a transparent and participatory process because they were also very skeptical about the motivation of the government. And after the several informal negotiations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs finally agreed for an unprecedented level of civil society participation. So we had, not like Sweden, we had never such a participatory process of policy making with civil society, but it was almost first time for the civil society to participate in the process from the drafting level. So they agreed to set up informal drafting committee with representatives of civil society working group, also academics and representative of relevant government agencies. And that was also supplemented by other measures for wider civil society consultation. And because of this participatory process, Japanese National Action Plan had some unique features. First of all, it covers both of armed conflicts and also disaster situations. And also, Ministry of Foreign Affairs saw WPS as exclusively as a foreign issues. Like Leandra said, they saw that it is a issue to support women elsewhere and not here. But a civil society group insisted that WPS agenda should be applied to domestic issues, and insisted on some specific domestic actions, including to address gender and race-based hate speech and gender-sensitive response to asylum seekers. Also, Korea and Japan has a large US military bases So we also, insisted on the addressing sexual violence by U.S. military, and also we as Japan, as there's a very weak gender mainstreaming in governance in Japan, so we also insisted on that. And also, finally, civil society working group strongly demanded to make a reference to historical responsibility of Japan, including comfort of women issue. So there were a lot of negotiations between MOFA and the civil society working group, but we finally agreed to have a final draft. But this participatory process was undermined by the political intervention by the conservative forces at the last minute of the drafting process. So without notice, some of the major features of this National Action Plan was altered at the last minute. So for example, the term gender was totally deleted from the Japanese language version. Probably you won't understand this, but the conservative force of the Japanese conservative force in Japan were very much opposed to the use of gender itself. So so they really didn't like to have word gender. They are okay with English language version, but not for Japanese version. And also reference to comfort of women was deleted, and other issues like US military sexual violence or hate speech. And also very importantly, they made the roles of civil society in monitoring and evaluation very much weakened. So, so even though the in the drafting process, it was agreed between civil society working group and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that civil society would continue to play major role in monitoring and evaluation, that space was severely limited in the final process. So, however, having said that, the implementation and monitoring and evaluation has been quite not so much. I won't say that this due to these changes, this National Action Plan is totally a tool for the conservative government. Because evaluation committee, which is consisted of mainly academics, has played significant role in operationalizing WPS and gender mainstreaming of implementing agencies. However, civil society engagement has significantly declined due to broken trust with the government and also narrowed space for engagements. And also participants have shifted from feminist and peace organizations to aid and humanitarian NGOs. So overall, monitoring evaluation has been effective in operationalizing gender mainstreaming of Japanese ODA and PKO, but also the issue has been depoliticized with weak involvement of feminist peace movement. So my last point, to answer the question of if NAP be a useful tool for implementing WPS agenda, the answer might be yes, but we also ask if WPS agenda can be a useful tool for building peace in East Asia. And I am quite not sure. And I also shared a lot of concern with Leandra about the usefulness of WPS agenda in promoting feminist, transformative feminist peace agenda. Because East Asia has no hot conflicts. We don't have, armed action, but there are rising tensions and militarization expanding in this region. But in order to address these issues, there are I see inherent problems with WPS agenda because it is only concerned with internationally recognized armed conflicts, and also it centers militarism as a way to secure peace and security. Their understanding is very much limited, and also framework is very much state-centric. So from the perspective transformative feminist peace, we need to challenge historical imperialism. As Leandra said, we really need to focus on the role of global laws, and of course, issues of racism and militarism and nationalism. So I hope that if this panel will be the chance to talk about possibility for repoliticizing WPS agenda with the strong feminist, transformative feminist peace perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaka, for showing and sharing this complexity really that it is. And thank you to all 4 speakers for your presentations. Now we turn to the 3 discussants. And we start with Nandin Taushig-Tsugbayar, who is an international treaties and foreign relations specialist at the National Committee on Gender Family Equality at the Government of Mongolia. Currently, she is a member of the working group that is aiming to determine whether it's mandatory and when to develop a national action plan for the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Please, Nandin Taushig-Tsugbayar.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And also thank you very much for having me as a discussant of this event being organized on the occasion of International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament. And as many of you know, Mongolia does not have the NAP on Women, Peace and Security agenda. So today I would like to talk about Mongolia's needs and opportunities for developing a NAP and preconditions to support the NAP development. Even if our country is not located in a war or conflict zone, there are many insecurities that are faced by Mongolian women and girls, including women's low participation in decision-making and domestic and gender-based violence and poverty, as well as women's political empowerment. I will briefly explain Mongolia's need to draft and implement the NAP in the context of increasing the representation of women in decision-making and also eliminating violence against women and girls and women in security and defense sector. First of all, let me talk about the women's participation in decision-making. Our country has been very successful in ensuring and promoting gender equality, and is relatively high in many areas such as education and employment, health, and social protection. However, like many other countries in the world, women's participation in the decision-making is very low in Mongolia. Today, 17% of the parliament members and 25% of the government ministers are women, and Mongolia has 21 provinces, and each province has its own local governor, but there are no women among those 21 local governors. From this, we can see that there's an urgent need to increase the representation of the women at decision-making level in the local provinces. And secondly, the elimination of violence against women and girls. Well, like gender-based violence and domestic violence are they're one of the most common and serious human rights violations in Mongolia. According to the country's first GBV study, which is conducted in 2017, 30% of the ever partnered women have been subjected to intimate partner violence during their lifetime. And more than half, like 60% of the Mongol women who have been in a relationship with a man have experienced one or more forms of violence at some stage in their life. And also 31% of women have experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. Thirdly, the military women. In Mongolia, men and women, regardless of gender, enlist in the military voluntarily. As of today, about 30% of the all defense personnel are women. Our country has been actively involved in UN peacekeeping operations since 2003, and still there is a need to pay attention to specific needs and interests of female military personnel. And military personnel are assigned to the places where they are needed, so their families have to go with them. For this reason, the family members face issues such as losing jobs and losing incomes, and also their ability to afford housing becomes low, and also there's an issue with children's education, health, and social services. There are certain preconditions to support the NAP development. Most importantly, the policy and legal environment has been created to facilitate the development and implementation of 1325 in Mongolia. Some issues and activities in the field of security and foreign policy have been coordinated with relevant initiatives and programs of domestic government and non-governmental organizations and civil society and international development partners. And also the staff of the local ministries and agencies who are expected to be involved in the development and implementation of the National Action Plan are relatively competent, but they need to be provided with unified leadership and support for cooperation with public and civil society. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer all the questions from you in the QA session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nandin Tushik. And now we turn to Brussels, I think, to the European Union, even though I see Swedish flags on the screen behind you. Mrs. Charlotte Isaksson represents the European Union and is Senior Gender Advisor in the European External Action Service. She has been the penholder for the EU strategic approach to women, peace and security and its action plan. Mrs. Isaksson has during her professional career worked primarily with gender equality and women, peace and security issues in the domain of security and defense, including operations and missions at NATO and the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters and with the Swedish Ministry of Defense. She has a military background, but also holds degrees in sociology and international relations, and is currently finalizing her PhD in politics at the University of Bristol. And as I understand it, it is about the political economy of women, peace and security. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agneta, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for getting us together for this important session today. And also thank you to the previous speakers for a very inspiring and rich introduction to this session, and of course also to my fellow discussants. And I would like to just briefly say a few things about our work in the European Union, where we in 2018 and 2019 updated our policy framework on women, peace and security, which we consider is a very solid and robust one. And it is really developed in very close dialogue and coordination with all the EU member states, as well as in a very close dialogue and consultation with civil society. And for that, we are very proud, because that is a way for us to walk the talk and to work along the lines that is very much in the core of 1325, namely to make sure that it is designed and planned and built very robustly upon the civil society partners. So our policy framework is based around the key pillars of course, prevention of conflict, prevention of all forms of conflict-related violence, women's participation in all matters related to peace and security, both internally and externally. So both within our own institutions, but also women's meaningful participation in peace processes, mediation, conflict prevention, reconstruction, rehabilitation, etc., etc. Protection of women's rights and women's bodies. So it's two things equally important. And of course, the very important pillar of relief and recovery. But we also identify the importance of adding two additional objectives for time being. And one is gender mainstreaming, the systematic mainstreaming of the gender perspective, and basing that on a solid gender analysis, and the objective of leading by example, to do what we say we should do, and to do that with a good quality, and to not ask from anyone else to do things that we do not, as a European Union, do ourselves. Another unique feature with our policy framework is that it is really both external and domestic internal. This was a very strong wish by our member states, and it is really closely linked to gender equality and the broader women's empowerment agenda, and not limited to issues related to migration and asylum seeking and refugees, etc. But of course, that's part of that. So women, peace and security is not one objective really. It's both aiming at gender equality and peace and security. And just because we have peace, we might not have either gender equality or security. Or if we have gender equality, we might not have peace and security. And I think the latest situation we have seen that taking place is perhaps in Colombia, where we had a very inclusive peace process and a lot of inclusion of women and the gender perspective, but still after the peace agreement is signed, that didn't necessarily enhance the safety for women. When we speak about security, we speak about human security. We also relate the Women, Peace and Security agenda to, of course, the CEDAW, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Beijing Platform for Action, and the Vienna Declaration. So it's a part of a family of different frameworks, and we work with all of them comprehensively. We also have our leadership walking the talk, so to speak. So not too long ago, just to share an example, building on the previous HRVP, the current HRVP, Mr. Borrell, met with local women peace builders. It was a meeting organized by a very close partner in Brussels, European Peace Building Liaison Office. Another thing we do very much and increasingly is to work together with multilateral and regional partners, such as, of course, the United Nations, its agencies, African Union, NATO, League of Arab States, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OSCE, G7, etc., etc. And also within the ASEAN context. And you probably very well aware that in 2019, there was a very strong foreign ministerial statement in August on women, peace and security, where the foreign ministers expressed concern about threats to regional stability and prosperity posed by armed conflicts and increasing numbers of refugees and displaced persons, including women and children. And they stated very strongly that they are committed to increase the meaningful participation of women, including women's civil society organizations and networks, in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, in the prevention, management, resolution of armed conflict, as well as post-conflict peace building, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. So with that, I end my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And we now turn to our third discussant, Dr. Zeynep Alemdar from Turkey. You are Professor of International Relations at Okan University in Istanbul, where you also had the Faculty of Business and Administrative Sciences. Dr. Alemdar is the founder and director of the Women in Foreign Policy Initiative in Turkey, and has extensive experience in promoting gender equality in Turkey, working with international organizations, including UN Women, World Bank, and the European Union, and civil society groups. Dr. Alemdar has been specifically working on how Turkey can develop a national action plan for the resolution 1325. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What an honor to be included in this group and actually to meet with people who I already know, sometimes met in different occasions, but in these COVID times, it's great to meet with the Asian friends as well. So I think I would better start with with stating the obvious that we've been me at the Women in Foreign Policy Initiative, we've been working to develop a national action plan for Turkey since 2014, and Turkey still does not have a national action plan, unfortunately. But the interesting thing is that it's not that we do see a particular non-interest from the side of the government or the foreign ministry, but rather it hasn't been a priority. So what we have been doing at the Women in Foreign Policy Initiative is actually to, get this on the agenda and raise some awareness, both within the civil society and within the bureaucratic circles, about the importance of a gender, peace, and security agenda for Turkey. So what we have done in terms of within the civil society realm has been it's basically, of course, usually through projects, but what we tried to do was to raise awareness, and then back in 2016, with the support of UN Women and at the time Swedish Consulate in Istanbul, to get together different civil society organizations, different women's civil society organizations in Turkey, to actually not only to raise awareness about the 1325, but also to talk amongst ourselves as well, because we do have as most of the world, a very polarized civil society sometimes as well. So we were trying to get, various parts of the civil society and get them to talk about 1325 and find this common ground of women, peace, and security. But of course, all these issues that my colleagues, especially in the civil society, have raised, also, of course, came up in our discussions. And therefore, I'm actually very happy and I mean, would love to keep in touch so that we can learn a bit more from each other. But after that, back in 2020, for the 20th year of the 1325, we did a different project, this time within Women in Foreign Policy, and we focused on the priority areas of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we developed reports and recommendations for the Turkish state, basically, to how to integrate the women, peace, and security agenda in its foreign policy. And the issues were the diplomatic corps. So how we can increase the number of women in the MFA, which was not particularly necessary for the Turkish MFA, because we do have close to 30%, which is a very good number for amongst the other ministries in Turkey. But it was interesting because although we do have a lot of women in the Turkish MFA, they didn't particularly know a lot about 1325. And the Turkish Foreign Ministry is actually very active in the mediation efforts all over the world. So we were basically showing in this report, we are suggesting that, we are recommending that it would be nice for the ministry to actually make use of these women in mediation efforts that it is active in. Another subject that we looked into was the army and the international peace operations. Again, this is a very, amongst us, the feminists, it's an important issue, would we, about the inclusion of women in the military. But we came to the conclusion that it was very important for Turkey, since it's a, member of NATO and its geography as well. And therefore, we said that it would be of interest to women if the Turkish military actually increases some financial incentives, especially for the international peace operations, so that it can include more women in its in the military rank. Then the third issue, and a very not least important in the end, is refugee and asylum policies. This is, a crucial issue for Turkey. As you know, Turkey hosts most of the Syrian refugees, as well as many other refugees as well, such as the Afghans and the Iraqis. So we were recommending how to get refugee women, how to protect refugee women, especially against gender-based violence. And our main recommendation was actually, how to get them into the safe houses that Turkey actually does have some safe houses. And the fourth subject was international humanitarian aid. Again, another very important issue in Turkish foreign policy. And Turkey boasts of, doing a lot of international foreign aid, and we were basically recommending the state institution how to increase its efforts in gender equality, and to actually put women and gender in the midst of its in humanitarian aid policy. So with these 4 reports, we have reached some people, mostly in the foreign ministry as well. And we have done a lot of dissemination thanks to mostly our Swedish friends, and we have done consultations within the OSCE as well. So the feeling is that maybe, yes, it might become a priority at some point. But on the other hand, as the from our civil society hat, one of the things that we are of course wondering is that if we have a national action plan, should it be from the foreign ministry? Can it be a good mix of the civil society and the foreign ministry, or any of the interested ministries? Giving the defense ministry, of course, the interior ministry, and all those. And so, do we need local action plans? That's another issue that we are always contemplating. And in our 2016 project, that was kind of what we got at, that maybe we can have local action plans. So at the Women in Foreign Policy Initiative, we are working on these issues. And we do believe that national action plan, although a good national action plan with the understanding that we are not going to militarize the 1325 or victimize women, is of course our aim. And but again, I would like to reiterate that it's actually good to know that. I mean, it's not good to have worries, but it's good to be able to exchange the solutions to the common concerns that we all have. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeynep Alemdar. Even though we have a couple of questions in our Q&A function, I first turn to the four speakers. Does somebody of you want to comment what has been said already by other speakers or by the discussant? Just put your hand up like this, and if you want to comment. Or do you want me to turn to you in a row? And start with Carolina. Do you have any comments?
Thank you. No, I think it's interesting and vitalizing for the agenda to have this both conversation that's both interregional and also involving research and civil society representation and governments. I think that's it's good for the vitalization of the discussion. I think it's also good not to get stuck in how we construct and conduct national action plans. They are an instrument. It's not easy to make the ideal national action plan that is both owned, executed, and kind of leads political will or commitment to implementation. I think it's a lot of different things that has to be put into place at the same time to make that happen. Nevertheless, I think national action plans can really be a leverage and a support structure for that work. So I thought it was a very interesting discussion to listen to, and I think it's also shows that the WPS agenda is much more complex than some actors would like to see it as. And we've had the possibility during the spring to interact with partners on also where they see this agenda standing today, and this issue of moving into a more militarized or politicized agenda being seen very different from different partners. And I think it's clear to us that it again, as I said before, it's not something that operates in a vacuum. Also, I think it should not be, or at least the way that we work with it, it's not that it's a clear stand between where do women, peace and security end and gender equality start, or peace and security start, but it often goes into the same direction. We also think that if women, peace and security is a tool for foreign policy, that does not mean only security. It also means development. It also means human rights, etc. So just to say that I find this an interesting and good discussion to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Yoon, do you have anything to add?
I was also very much fascinated with the other speakers' presentations as well as the discussants' comments. And I mean, mostly I was also kind of struck by, well, the civil society perspective presented by Leandra and Hisako. I look forward to further discussion on the points that they raised later on in the session today. And also Zeynep, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but really it's struck me that activists can think about local action plans ahead of national action plans, because for me, when I was reviewing national action plans and the women, peace and security agenda in other countries, I've always thought of it as kind of a process that began with the national action plan, but this is a really new paradigm for me. So I hope we have time to discuss more about this later on today.
Thank you very much. Leandra, do you want to comment?
Yes, I would actually like to really pick up on Charlotte, what she said, and what I really liked on that we have to lead by example. This is obviously one phrase we often use, right, when we advocate for things vis-a-vis our own government. And one aspect I wanted to highlight that I couldn't touch upon for lack of time is also that this goes hand in hand with disarmament, or rather the skyrocketed military expenditure, right, where Switzerland is very complicit in that. So are other countries in the global north, and this is something that we tend to forget. We have today the Peace and Disarmament Day, we have a Women, Peace and Security agenda, and we want to implement that all while having now 2 trillion. This is a record ever since 1988. So that is probably the most visible contradiction that we are witnessing. So unless we tackle that, this will really remain dead letter on paper, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And Hisako, you have to unmute.
Sorry. So yes, I also like to discuss more about how we can reimagine our the way that women and peace and security in different ways, and particularly when we are facing with the challenge of the pandemic, global pandemic, which really shows us that we really need to look at the deep problem in our global system, like including care burden. And also, as we have some speakers from Sweden, which is proud of its feminist foreign policy, and Japanese really like to copy some of its elements. But I also researching WPS agenda, and it also came to my mind that if state can be really agent for a feminist transformation. So so that is also one issue I have been struggling with. So thanks.
Thank you. I see that we have several questions in the Q&A function. So I believe that one of my colleagues, Ebba, she was introducing herself initially. You have followed the Q&A function. Can you put forward one of the questions for comment by the speakers?
Of course, thank you, Agneta. The first question in the Q&A is from our colleague here, Julian Tucker, who said thank you very much to all the speakers. He wants to know how peace building, he wants to know more about peace building in Afghanistan, and wonders how governments and CSOs support women peace builders in an overtly violent environment, and how to best interact with militant groups like the Taliban with track records of gender-based violence.
Yeah, who want to comment about that? I include the discussants in the possibility to answer. Nobody? Nandin Tushig, what do you think? It's Charlotte.
No, it's not an easy thing to do. I think we can all agree to that. I think also most of us here, represent organizations and nations who are in different ways quite actively trying to support the Afghan citizens aiming for peace, etc. So, for example, we in the European Union, we support politically, we support diplomatically, we support, of course, now with the upcoming peace talks, etc., and what is happening in Doha. But also, of course, we do support financially, we support technically, and as I tried to say before, that for us, the local civil society actors and the peace builders themselves are really at the core of our work on women, peace and security. So they are the ones we have to support and help with all our instruments. But of course, in an unstable and insecure and very dangerous environment, of course, it goes without saying that that is a very difficult task to do, because then also we come into aspects of risks and threats and insecurity, etc., which is it's a challenge. It is a challenge, but I think a lot of things are being done, and indeed women peace builders in Afghanistan and in other places are very much at the core of what we are doing in terms of the long-term peace process in Afghanistan. And that said, I also want to really emphasize that means that they tell us what they find important to prioritize. So that's very much how we see that.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's a long way to go until the resolution 1325 will be a reality around. Carolina, do you want to comment as well?
Just to maybe add, I mean, we subscribe to what was just said. I think just also the issue of constantly making sure that this is on the agenda, and to make sure that we as governments and regional organizations and actors bring this to the table. I think in Afghanistan, the amount of women represented, for example, in the different national committees on peace, such as the High Council, the High Peace Council, is something that we monitor closely and we follow, and we bring into the coordination groups where Sweden is present. But it's not only the presence of women, it's also where can they take part. If discussions happens elsewhere, which they often do, are they actually able to also follow? Or and so I think this is something that it's about a political conversation that has to be there. But also, I mean, Sweden, for example, trained women in central position from all regions in Afghanistan as mediators, also to not to buy into a narrative anywhere where it's said that there are no women who are competent to actually be participating in discussions on peace and security in the future of the country. So I think there are different ways that we can also do things very specifically. Thank you.
Any other comment on this, or shall we ask Ebba for putting forward another question?
Sure, I can go ahead and raise another question. Amanda Blomster has a question for Hisako Motoyama about Motoyama's comment that there are no armed actions on the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Japan. And what would your recommendations be on armed actions that could be taken by Japan on the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
Yes, I have to apologize to make you an audience confused about the Japanese action, military action on WPS agenda, and there had been a military action on the Japanese by Japanese security defense forces on the WPS agenda. So a lot. There are expanding military actions taken by Japanese SDF, self-defense forces, for the implementing WPS agenda. Or rather, I would say WPS agenda has been useful tool for expanding military actions on overseas by Japanese self-defense forces, which is to basically to defense, for the defense, but they're actually expanding its actions outside of Japan. And I'm not sure how much you know about the Japanese constitution, but it is a product of the the product of the Japanese, the imperial war and U.S. occupation. So during the U.S. occupation, the U.S. crafted this constitution that basically prohibits government to go into war. And so, the Japanese post-war history has been the challenge, challenge this constitution and also defense. So, Japan has been involved in the peace building since 1991, when Japan was critiqued by the U.S. for not making, military contribution to the Gulf War. So it is also very much fascinating to see, because WPS agenda is to be promoted as a way to protect women, but is also a way for Japan to demasculinize itself on the global agenda as a peace builder for women. So, and from the civil society perspective, I really want to challenge the idea that we really need to rely on military force to make peace possible. And I think that is the kind of essential issue for us to question, and how we address root causes of the, insecurity in this global world. So I would say, so what I would say about the Japanese military action, I would say Japan should really think deeply about if there are other ways to contribute to peace without expanding military actions. At least we still have this constitution, and even though it has been very weakened. So did I answer your question?
We hope so. Thank you. Ebba, we have another two questions. I think it's proper to cover what the audience asked us to.
Johannes Nadine has a question.
Yeah, well, we can't hear you, Ebba.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay. Johannes Nordin asked a question about Leandra Bias' presentation, where she mentioned that the reproduction of stereotypical gender roles and the view of women empowerment as a tool rather than a goal in the Swiss National Action Plan. And Johannes is wondering if any other speakers has identified similar issues in their respective country or institution.
Is it anybody that want to comment about that? Similar to Switzerland? Yeah, Charlotte?
Yeah, very briefly, I think for us, the implementation of women, peace and security is both an end and a mean. So it's not one or the other, it's both. Because of course we see clearly the benefit of having, for example, more women taking active part in peace negotiations, etc. And of course, that is then something that contributes to the wished for outcome of sustainable peace. So for us, that's not really a problematic view, but we have listened very well to our civil society colleagues, and this is also why we have written into our policy that it is important that women, peace and security is not instrumentalized, so that if we use aspects on women's participation, for example, to whatever end, it's critical that is also then evaluated against the objectives of gender equality and women's rights, and not only countering violent extremism, for example, or only something else that might not at all benefit those women we wish to have enhanced rights for. Thank you.
Leandra, perhaps you want to comment as well?
Perhaps rather to add or further clarify, because it was about harmful gender roles that get further entrenched, right, in the women, peace and security agenda. And one thing that we see is that most national action plans lack a reference to masculinities. And if we speak again about the care economy, right, this is not something we are going to solve if we only look at half of the population, right? We can empower them, yes, but to somehow put it provocatively, we also have to disempower the other half, or to make them reflect and change certain gender roles. So that is one thing that we see. It's great that there has been a very strong focus on women, but it cannot be only on women.
Thank you. We have another 3 questions. Ebba, can you put forward one of them?
Yes, I can. We have 2 questions from Sandra Sovria, and I might try to ask them together, although they are a bit different. First of all, she said, thank you very much to the speakers. And she's wondering, climate security was mentioned as something relevant to bring in the Women, Peace and Security agenda and as a potential challenge to its implementation. And if you could elaborate on how climate security connects to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The second question is about if the speakers could elaborate on the issue and challenge with not having an allocated budget for the UNSCR 1325 National Action Plan, and what are the main challenges in allocating the budget, and how can this be a challenge for its implementation?
Who wants to?
Well, can I quickly answer the question about the budget? Yeah, so the South Korean National Action Plan currently has this budget problem. And because no separate budget is allocated to implement the National Action Plan, and so far this has been the case. And so early on, when the National Action Plan was first issued, in the early years, what we saw happening is government ministries kind of trying to fit in what they were already doing that seemed, even if it was something remotely related to women, peace and security agenda, they kind of listed it as part of the activities they do to implement 1325 National Action Plan. And so this is definitely a challenge and a limit. And so in the third National Action Plan that was most recently issued, there is a strategy was included where government relevant ministries have to make an effort to have a budget category to implement the 1325 National Action Plan within the ministry. But we will have to see how successful they will be in the next 3 years in actually securing their own budget for this. But hopefully this will initiate a movement within each ministry to get the money to actually pursue activities that are really relevant to implementing strategies.
Thank you. Carolina, do you also want to comment?
Thank you. Yes, since I brought up the climate issue, I can just try to say something about it. It is very complex, so I'm happy the question is posed. I think it's partly that's also why we are mentioning it, because it's something that I think we need to dive more into. I think both UN Women and the Swedish Institute for Peace and Security has looked into this issue, but maybe first to start with that the resolution 2242 on women, peace and security adopted by the Security Council in 2015 brought this into the package of women, peace and security. And I think it was also showing how women, peace and security is a comprehensive framework that relates to ongoing issues in the world and globally. And the easy answer is, of course, that climate change and risks to reinforce and enlarge or evoke conflict, and there women, peace and security needs to play a role. I think if you look at specific countries, it could be either that women are not able to mitigate climate risks because of the violence that they're facing, or because their lack of access to information, or a lack of access to participation. And I think one of the issues that needs to come into place is then to say, if communities should be resilient to climate change, women has to also be included in that response. And of course, the other way of looking at it is the impact it has on women and men differently due to health issues or livelihoods, etc. So I think there are many issues here that we can explore. And then just quickly on the challenge of not having, as we don't, a specific budget connected to the National Action Plan is, of course, then the political commitment has to be strong. There has to be strong accountability mechanisms. On the other hand, it does not then have a limit in a sense. We have found that it's been very efficient to work with women, peace and security and National Action Plan in the way that it is integrated into ordinary budgets, and that the accountability then comes from reporting on activities done. Thank you.
Thanks. Ebba, we have still at least one more question we can take. I don't think we have time for more than one, but you choose one of the questions.
I will take the question that came in the earliest, which is from Mikael Torsson. In the Women, Peace and Security agenda, peace and security is often mentioned together, but could you expand on the differences and if there are any conflicts between these two, rather than different terms in relationship with the woman part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
Does anybody want to comment? Just do like this. Yeah, Leandra.
Yes, thank you for this excellent question. It is honestly one that I think has been with us ever since the agenda came about, and I don't think we'll ever solve it. And that is also because it was a strategic move, right? Around the time, it was very clear feminist civil society thought, if we manage to get a resolution through in the Security Council, we'll have the biggest mandate we can have for our issues. So it had to be a security issue. Even though it came from peace, it had to be framed in terms of security. And that's where also the whole human security agenda came from, right? To expand the notion that this is not, security does not finish, or if it ever starts, actually at state borders and the sovereign protection, but it is about every human being and their human rights being protected and guaranteed. So, but that also means that from the very beginning, we inscribed a contradiction in it, because it was implemented in a military institution, but with a non-military goal at the end. And I think that is really a dilemma we are grappling with on a daily basis. And what you see in the Swiss example, for example, that is quite interesting, is that the unit within our government that is responsible for implementing the National Action Plan was until recently called the Unit or the Division for Human Security. And now it's been renamed into the Division for Peace and Human Rights, but nothing else changes. So that just shows you in the most striking way that the terms really are interchangeable. And what is behind them stays the same, is that you have on the one hand actors that really want to push for human rights and their protection, and they say that that notion obviously encompasses the whole world, because that vision of peace has not been achieved anywhere, and others who focus on what was earlier called just hot conflicts.
Thank you. Zeynep, do you want to add a comment as well? It looks like that.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually going to make the same comment. Thank you, Leandro, for that. It's, I think, for someone like me who's been trying to get a national action plan in Turkey, these questions have always been, have always been haunting us actually. So when we are talking about this, securitization of this agenda and or instrumentalizing women in terms of this, it's up until, I mean, for me, and this is going to sound really utilitarian, but for me, it's like, let's, until getting a national action plan, let's do this, after that we will talk about it. But of course, it's, why I use the word haunting, it's of course, when we are preparing this national action plan, even it's going to be a shadow action plan or a local action plan or whatever that is going to be, then we are going to be there, we would like to cover all the bases possible. But yet, while in theory, all these sound, rosy and pink and wonderful, oh, we've got a national action plan, I'm still, every day we are still struggling with this idea that, oh my God, what happens if, they misunderstand what we are trying to do and implement it in a way that is actually going to go against, what we are really trying to do. So, so this is, this is a question that has been haunting us, but I think once we have the tools for this, I think we still should go for it. And maybe, what we are trying to do, for example, in Turkey is actually to get, international organizations like the OSCE, NATO, the European Union, to actually, get on our side and try to get this action plan at least in writing in some form or another. So thank you.
Thank you, Zeynep. Just a
very short. Okay, so I think it's important also to remember that no one owns women, peace and security, because I hear many times different claims, I was writing it, so I'm the one who knows, exactly what was the thought, etc. It's actually something that each government and each organization owns. And of course, as every concept, they are also changing as they go. So that's how it is with everything, but also just acknowledging the fact that we see increasing insecurities and risks and threats towards women's activists, women's civil society, women peace builders, etc. So for us, women's security is an important and critical matter to deal with. And that's also where security has its own right. And when we think about security, we also speak to a very large extent about law enforcement and not only military. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, very short, Hisako.
Thank you so much. I just want to add quickly that sometimes we have to remember that women's security comes in contrast with national security. That is what the Okinawan feminists have told us, that their security has been undermined due to the national security, with as the U.S. military bases were located in their own community and actually undermining women's security. So we really need to have this framework for the women to redefine security in their own terms, not in, so it should not come from somewhere from the international institution or government. That is a women to redefine.
Thank you. And thank you all speakers and discussants for the very different perspective you have contributed with this morning. And now, as the webinar goes to its end, I will, at last but not least, we will listen to some closing remarks by our co-organizer and Dr. Unha Zhang. I first present you, and then the concluding words goes to you. You are director of the Center for International Development and Cooperation at the Korean Women's Development Institute. And prior to joining the institute, you were a research fellow at the Center for International Studies at Yonsei University, where you also had you have your doctoral degree. Earlier on, Dr. Zhang was a adjunct professor at Yonsei University and lecturer at Yonsei and Korea University. And you have won Best Lectures Award 3 times, both from Korea University and Yonsei University. And your research interests include gender and development, international humanitarian assistance, women, peace and security agenda. Please, to the concluding remarks.
Oh, thank you so much for the introduction, but also thank you so much, Dr. Agneta, for your wonderful moderation today. I also thank all the participants online, and also I would like especially thank ISDP for co-hosting this webinar. And actually, Lovelace, thank you so much for all your work. Without you, I don't think this webinar would have been possible. Let me say just a few words as a closing. So just to give you a little bit of background why we were conceiving this kind of webinar. First, as a national think tank under the Prime Minister's Office of South Korea, we have a mandate to actually support the government with research on how best to implement this global agendas, related with women in South Korea. So our first, and as a drafting institution for this NAPs, national NAPs, we actually wanted to find out how other countries with NAPs are doing, and how these countries without NAPs are actually implementing WPS agenda. And most importantly, because Asia is very weak on any regional organization in terms of women's agendas, we were actually very wondering how regional national action plan in Europe and in other parts of the world would actually help promote this agenda nationally. Today, I've learned so much. We found some commonalities as well as some differences. And I just wanted to introduce one thing that we actually had ISDP and KWDI also had a very long-term perspective to this, which is someday later, we want to actually invite the North Korean expert to this table. As you know well, these two countries, North Korea and South Korea, is still technically at war with each other without peace treaty. And we're hoping that when that day comes, when we can actually sign the peace treaty, I hope women from both Koreas, their voices can strongly be reflected in this peace talk and processes, and that this peace treaty becomes more sustainable and more lasting. And I personally think that this multilateral settings and also third-party support is really, really critical in making this our dream happen someday. So I actually ask for this expert here and also our audiences that in someday we can, realize this dream and have more peace on this peninsula as well as in this region. Again, my last point is that I just hope that this is only the beginning of our talk and we keep talking about these issues. So keep in mind that we may contact you later. We have another forum coming in the fall, co-hosted by ISDP and KWDI. We will let you know, probably on the issue of North Korean women and children. And really hope that next time we meet in person, whether in Sweden, in Turkey, and also in Korea. So let's hope for that. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.